Chosen one, a DNA test exposed why your soulmate could never marry you. The family was left stunned. God says, "My child, listen carefully. There are moments when one small discovery rearranges an entire lifetime. There are moments when a sealed envelope becomes heavier than 1,000 conversations. Your soulmate is standing near one of those moments. Something hidden inside their family story has begun rising into the light. It is not merely a secret about the past. It is something that explains why love between you and them always seemed blocked by an invisible wall. You felt the distance. You noticed the hesitation. You sensed the strange silence whenever marriage became serious. But you never knew what stood behind it. Now, a truth connected to their bloodline has begun changing everything. And the most surprising part is this: they never understood the reason themselves. They only knew that something kept pulling them away from the future they secretly imagined with you. Your soulmate has carried questions they could never explain. They wondered why certain family members reacted so strongly whenever your name appeared. They wondered why conversations suddenly became uncomfortable. They wondered why their own heart wanted one thing while their circumstances demanded another. For a long time, they blamed themselves. They thought they were afraid of commitment. They thought they needed more time. They even convinced themselves that perhaps their feelings for you were temporary. But deep inside, another voice refused to disappear. That voice remembered you. It remembered your presence during quiet moments. It remembered the strange comfort they felt around you. It remembered the way your connection never seemed ordinary. Something about you reached a place they had protected for years. Yet their family history stood between that feeling and the life they wanted. Now, imagine the atmosphere inside a quiet room where a DNA report has just been opened. Nobody speaks at first. A hand remains frozen above the paper. Someone reads the result twice. Then again. The room becomes painfully still. A family member looks toward another person without saying a word. Their expression changes. Their breathing becomes shallow. Suddenly, years of assumptions begin collapsing one by one. The test did not simply answer a biological question. It uncovered a connection that nobody expected to find. That discovery forced them to reconsider old stories. It forced them to revisit family decisions. It forced them to ask why certain relationships had always been treated as impossible. And somewhere inside that confusion, your soulmate finally understood something about you. The obstacle was never simply a lack of love. That realization hurt. It also brought relief. Because for years, they had wondered whether their inability to marry you meant their feelings were not strong enough. They had watched opportunities pass while pretending everything was normal. They smiled during family gatherings while carrying an ache nobody could see. They listened when relatives discussed suitable partners. They nodded when people described what their future should look like. But inside, they kept returning to you. There was always something unfinished. There was always one person their heart could not completely release. That person was you. The DNA discovery made their silence impossible to maintain. Suddenly, The family had to confront an old truth they had buried beneath assumptions and carefully constructed explanations. One person remembered a conversation from years ago. Another remembered a family document that had never made sense. Someone else recalled a name that had quietly disappeared from their family history. Piece by piece, the forgotten story began returning. And with every detail, your soulmate became more emotionally unsettled. They realized that their family had been carrying a misunderstanding for longer than anyone knew. The revelation did not instantly solve everything. It opened deeper questions. Why had certain relationships been discouraged? Why had certain names been kept away? Why had marriage between certain people been treated as unacceptable? And why did your connection seem to sit directly inside the mystery? This is where their heart began changing. They stopped asking whether they could forget you. They started asking what would happen if they stopped running. That question frightened them. It also gave them hope. My beloved child, you have spent enough time believing that every closed door meant rejection. Sometimes a closed door hides information you were never given. Sometimes silence protects a truth that people themselves do not understand. Sometimes two people separate because circumstances are tangled around them. That does not mean the connection was imaginary. It means the story had layers neither person could see. Your soulmate is beginning to understand those layers now. They remember moments when you looked at them without demanding an explanation. They remember your patience. They remember conversations that ended too soon. They remember the feeling after you walked away. The room became quieter. Their thoughts became louder. They may have tried distracting themselves with work, friends, entertainment, or another relationship. Yet certain memories kept returning without permission. A song could bring you back. A familiar place could bring you back. A simple phrase could suddenly make their chest tighten. They did not understand why these memories survived. Now they are beginning to understand. Their heart had not forgotten because the story had never truly ended. The family discovery became a mirror. It showed them how much of their life had been shaped by inherited beliefs. They had followed expectations without questioning where those expectations began. They had accepted warnings without knowing the original reason. They had treated certain possibilities as forbidden because everyone before them had done the same. But now, the evidence was forcing them to think independently. That process is uncomfortable. It is also liberating. Somewhere beneath their fear, courage is quietly growing. They are beginning to separate family pressure from personal truth. They are beginning to recognize the difference between obedience and peace. They are beginning to understand that love cannot be measured by the number of obstacles surrounding it. And this realization is moving them closer to you emotionally, even before they take any physical step. There is another reason this discovery has affected them so deeply. It touched their identity. When someone learns that part of their family history was misunderstood, they naturally question other beliefs they considered permanent. Their childhood memories suddenly look different. Old photographs carry different meanings. Conversations once considered ordinary become suspicious. A familiar surname can feel strangely unfamiliar. Your soulmate is experiencing that shift quietly. They are looking at their own life through a new lens. They may not tell anyone yet. They may need time. But something inside them has awakened. They no longer want a future built entirely around other people's expectations. They want to know what their own heart is saying. And when they become completely honest with themselves, your presence appears again. Not as an obsession. Not as fantasy. As a meaningful possibility they never properly explored. This is why you should not measure this moment only by what is visible. Outwardly, nothing may seem different. Their phone may remain silent. Their distance may remain frustrating. Their family may still appear unchanged. But inwardly, a major shift has begun. A person who once accepted separation as permanent is now questioning it. A person who once feared difficult conversations is imagining them. A person who once believed the family story was complete is discovering missing pages. That is why this revelation matters. The DNA test did not magically create love. It exposed information that changed how your soulmate understood the barriers around that love. The family was left stunned because their assumptions suddenly had to face evidence. And your soulmate was left with an even harder realization. The future they once considered impossible might not be impossible for the reason they believed. Something they thought was settled may actually have been based on an incomplete truth. They cannot unsee that now. They cannot return completely to the person they were before the discovery. The question has changed. It is no longer, why can I never marry this person? It has become, who decided that I could never marry this person, and why? That question is opening a door. Behind it lies a history filled with silence, misunderstood relationships, and decisions made before your soulmate was old enough to question them. And deeper inside that history is the emotional truth they have been trying to avoid. They did not lose their feelings for you. They buried them beneath a story they were told to believe. Now that story is cracking. Slowly. Quietly. Completely. And before this journey is finished, they will have to face the one truth that scares them most. Their heart may have known your place in their life long before their family ever understood it. The morning after the discovery felt strangely ordinary, yet nothing inside your soulmate remained ordinary. Sunlight entered through the curtains, but their mind stayed fixed on the result. They placed the document on the table and stared at it again. Every line seemed to challenge something they had accepted for years. Their hands remained still, but their thoughts moved rapidly. They remembered every warning their family had given them. They remembered every conversation that ended whenever marriage became serious. They remembered the quiet disappointment in familiar faces. None of those memories felt simple anymore. A hidden question had entered their mind. What if the family had been protecting a belief instead of a truth? That possibility unsettled them more than the test itself. They could no longer pretend nothing had changed. The silence inside that house carried a different weight now. Everyone seemed careful with their words. Nobody wanted to be the first person to discuss what had happened. Yet everyone knew the subject was waiting between them. Your soulmate noticed the smallest details. A relative avoided eye contact during breakfast. Someone suddenly changed the conversation. Another person quietly left the room. Those actions said more than explanations could have said. The family was afraid of what the discovery might reveal next. But your soulmate was afraid of something else. They were afraid of realizing that they had sacrificed genuine love because of an inherited fear. For years, they had built emotional walls around themselves. Those walls looked strong from the outside. Inside, they were full of cracks. They had learned how to appear calm whenever your name was mentioned. They had learned how to smile when someone suggested another relationship. They had learned how to say they were busy when their heart wanted to reach toward you. It became a performance they repeated until even they almost believed it. Almost. Then the DNA result disturbed that carefully maintained illusion. Suddenly, every sacrifice demanded a second look. Every rejected possibility seemed to carry a different meaning. Every moment of distance felt connected to something deeper. They began remembering the first time they realized they cared about you. It was not dramatic. There was no perfect music or cinematic confession. It may have been something incredibly small. A look across a room. A conversation that stayed in their mind afterward. The way you listened without forcing them to explain everything. That ordinary moment had quietly become unforgettable. They tried to dismiss it. They failed. Then life continued, and family expectations became louder. Their relatives had ideas about the person they should marry. They had ideas about what kind of family would be acceptable. They had ideas about reputation, tradition, and what would keep everyone comfortable. Your soulmate listened. Because challenging those expectations felt dangerous. They were not necessarily afraid of you. They were afraid of disappointing people who had shaped their entire understanding of loyalty. That distinction matters. Their distance was not always a rejection of your love. Sometimes it was their attempt to remain safe inside a system they did not know how to question. Yet safety came with a price. Every time they walked away from you, they carried the emotional consequences alone. Their room became the place where the mask finally disappeared. Late at night, they would sit quietly with their phone nearby. Your conversation might remain unopened. Your name might remain unsent. Their fingers would hover over the screen. Then they would lock the phone again. Not tonight. They repeated that sentence many times. But postponing a truth does not make it disappear. It only gives the truth more time to grow. The family discovery made that growth impossible to ignore. They started asking questions they had never dared to ask before. Who knew the original story? Who made the decision? Who benefited from keeping certain information hidden? Why had everyone repeated the same explanation without verifying it? The answers were incomplete. Some relatives became defensive. Others became emotional. One person finally admitted they had never known the whole story either. That confession changed the atmosphere completely. Suddenly, the family was not united around certainty. They were standing around uncertainty. And uncertainty gave your soulmate something they had never possessed before. Permission to question. That permission became powerful. They began looking at old records. They remembered names mentioned by grandparents. They searched through family photographs and forgotten conversations. A box stored in a quiet corner suddenly seemed important. Inside were papers that had been untouched for years. Their hands trembled slightly as they opened them. There were dates, names, and faded handwriting. None of it immediately solved the mystery. But one detail connected to another. Then another. The pattern became difficult to dismiss. Your soulmate felt their heartbeat change. They understood that the family story had missing pieces. They also understood that those missing pieces had influenced their choices. The emotional wall around your connection had not appeared naturally. It had been reinforced by assumptions. That realization made them angry. Then sad. Then strangely relieved. They had spent so much time blaming themselves for not being brave enough. Now they wondered whether they had ever been given the complete truth needed to make an informed choice. Their pride began weakening. Pride had protected them from vulnerability. It allowed them to pretend they did not need you. It allowed them to act unaffected. It allowed them to tell themselves that walking away was strength. But strength without honesty had become exhausting. The test exposed something their pride could no longer cover. They still cared. Deeply. And the possibility of losing you permanently suddenly felt different. Before, they had assumed distance would eventually make the feelings disappear. Instead, distance had sharpened them. The longer they stayed away, the more clearly they understood what your absence meant. They noticed it during ordinary moments. They would hear someone laugh and remember yours. They would pass a place connected to you and slow down without realizing it. They would wake from sleep with your face already in their thoughts. Their mind kept returning to one unfinished question. What would happen if they finally stopped obeying fear? That question followed them everywhere. At work. In the car. During family dinners. Even in moments when they were surrounded by people. They could no longer escape their own honesty. The family expected them to move forward. They expected them to choose someone else. They expected time to erase the complicated feelings. But time had done the opposite. It had revealed them. Your soulmate began noticing how often they had confused peace with avoidance. Avoiding conflict had never brought genuine peace. It had only postponed discomfort. Avoiding your name had not healed their heart. It had simply kept the wound covered. Now the covering was coming away. And beneath it was something surprisingly gentle. Hope. Not certainty. Not a promise. Just hope. That small feeling frightened them because hope creates responsibility. Once someone admits they still hope for a particular future, they must decide whether they are willing to move toward it. Your soulmate was not ready for that decision yet. But they were getting closer. They began imagining a conversation with you. They imagined telling you why they disappeared. They imagined admitting that family pressure had influenced them. They imagined saying that their silence had never meant indifference. Every imagined sentence made their chest tighten. They would stop halfway through the thought. Then begin again. The emotional walls were weakening. They were no longer protecting the same version of themselves. Something inside them wanted truth more than approval. That shift did not happen overnight. It happened through dozens of small realizations. A quiet morning. An old photograph. A difficult family conversation. A memory of your voice. A moment alone in the car. Each one removed another brick from the wall. Eventually, the wall became impossible to maintain. One evening, a family member asked them a simple question about marriage. Your soulmate did not give the usual answer. They paused. That pause was tiny. But everyone noticed it. For the first time, they did not immediately surrender to the expected response. They looked down at the table. Then they quietly said they needed to make their own decision. The room became silent. Nobody argued immediately. Nobody laughed. The sentence had changed something. Your soulmate heard their own voice and realized how different it sounded. They had finally spoken from their own center. That moment did not solve the family conflict. It did something more important. It proved they could survive telling the truth. Afterward, they went outside alone. The evening air was cool against their face. They stood beneath a darkening sky and breathed slowly. Their heart was still frightened. But fear no longer controlled every movement. They thought about you again. This time, the thought did not feel like punishment. It felt like a direction. They understood that whatever happened next would require honesty. No more pretending. No more hiding behind family expectations. No more calling silence a solution. They still had questions about the DNA discovery. They still needed answers from relatives. They still needed to understand what the family had concealed or misunderstood. But their emotional position had changed. They were no longer asking whether their feelings were real. They were asking what those feelings deserved. And that question was taking them somewhere they had avoided for a long time. Toward you. The next stage would not begin with a dramatic confession. It would begin with something quieter. A private decision. A choice to uncover the complete truth before making another sacrifice. Once that decision settled inside them, the old version of their life began losing its authority. They had spent years protecting everyone else's comfort. Now, for the first time, they were preparing to protect the truth of their own heart. That private decision followed them into the deepest hours of the night, when every distraction finally became useless. The house had gone quiet. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator reached the hallway. Your soulmate sat beside a dark window, holding a glass of water that remained untouched. Their phone rested nearby. Your name was still there. They had opened the conversation several times that evening. Each time, they closed it before writing anything. Fear still had a voice. It whispered every possible consequence. What if the family was right? What if you had already moved on? What if the truth created more pain than peace? What if reaching toward you meant losing people they had spent their entire life trying to please? Those questions crowded their mind until their breathing became uneven. Then, something unexpected happened. They stopped arguing with themselves. They simply sat there. The silence became honest. For once, they did not try to choose the answer everyone else wanted. They asked themselves what they would regret most. Losing family approval would hurt. Losing the chance to live honestly would hurt differently. But losing you without ever telling the truth felt unbearable. Their eyes became heavy. They leaned back and closed them. Memories began arriving without invitation. Your smile. Your voice. A particular conversation. The feeling of being understood without explaining every detail. None of those memories demanded anything from them. They simply existed. That was what made them powerful. Your connection had survived without constant contact. It had survived distance, confusion, pride, and time. It had survived every attempt to make it ordinary. Their hand slowly moved toward the phone. Then stopped again. This time, they did not feel ashamed of the hesitation. They understood that courage does not always look like immediate action. Sometimes courage begins when someone finally admits they are afraid. Your soulmate whispered something to the empty room. They said your name. Just once. The sound seemed unfamiliar because they had avoided saying it aloud for so long. Then their shoulders relaxed. A tear moved slowly down their cheek. They wiped it away and looked toward the window. Outside, the sky was almost completely dark. A few distant lights flickered between buildings. The world looked peaceful while their inner world was changing completely. They realized something that had been hidden beneath every argument. They were not afraid of loving you. They were afraid of what loving you would require them to confront. That difference opened another door. They finally understood why their behavior had seemed contradictory. They could miss you intensely and still stay away. They could imagine marriage and still refuse to speak. They could care deeply and still allow fear to make decisions. None of those contradictions meant the connection was meaningless. They meant the person carrying those feelings had been divided inside. The DNA discovery had exposed the source of that division. Their family history had created rules around relationships. Those rules had become so familiar that nobody questioned them. Your soulmate had inherited those rules without realizing how deeply they shaped every choice. Now, standing alone beneath the night sky, they saw the pattern. Fear had been passed down like an old family story. Nobody had asked whether it still belonged to them. They had simply carried it forward. That realization was painful. It was also freeing. Their heart began separating inherited fear from personal truth. They could respect their family without surrendering every decision. They could understand the past without allowing the past to dictate the future. They could love people who disagreed with them and still choose honestly. This was the spiritual tipping point. Not because lightning struck the sky. Not because a mysterious voice announced their destiny. It happened inside a quiet human heart. The change was almost invisible. Yet it was enormous. They stopped waiting for everyone else to give permission. Their soul had already begun asking for honesty. And honesty kept leading them back to you. The next morning, they woke earlier than usual. The room was pale with dawn. For several seconds, they forgot about everything. Then the memory returned. The DNA result. The family conversation. The possibility that years of assumptions had been incomplete. They sat on the edge of the bed and breathed slowly. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, they felt focused. Something had shifted during the night. They needed facts. They needed to understand exactly what the test meant. They needed to speak with the relatives who knew the older family story. Most importantly, they needed to stop building their future around guesses. They began making a list. Names. Dates. Questions. Documents. Conversations. The list became longer than expected. But beneath every question was one deeper question. Why had the family believed marriage was impossible? That question remained at the center of everything. Later that day, your soulmate contacted someone who had always avoided discussing the past. The conversation began carefully. There were long pauses. At first, the answers were vague. Then your soulmate mentioned the DNA test. The silence on the other end became noticeable. Finally, the relative admitted there were details nobody had ever explained properly. Your soulmate felt their heartbeat rise. They asked for the truth. Not a softened version. Not a family-friendly explanation. The whole truth. The answer came slowly. There had been old assumptions about biological relationships and family connections. Some of those assumptions had influenced decisions made years earlier. People believed they were protecting the family from something complicated. But the original information had never been fully verified. That admission changed everything again. Your soulmate sat completely still. They realized how much power an unverified story could have over generations. One misunderstanding could become a rule. One rule could become tradition. One tradition could become fear. And fear could determine who people believed they were allowed to love. The room suddenly felt smaller. They looked at the phone in their hand and thought about you. For years, they had treated the barrier as permanent. Now they understood that permanence had never been proven. The obstacle had been built from incomplete knowledge. Their emotions became difficult to contain. They wanted to call you immediately. They wanted to explain every detail. They wanted to tell you that they had finally understood why they kept disappearing. But another part of them knew they needed to be careful. This was not a story to rush. It involved family history, identity, trust, and emotions that could not be repaired with one conversation. They needed to approach you with maturity. They needed to take responsibility for their silence. They needed to acknowledge the pain their absence may have caused. That realization humbled them. They stopped thinking only about what they wanted from you. They began thinking about what you deserved from them. You deserved clarity. You deserved honesty. You deserved someone who would not disappear whenever circumstances became difficult. That thought became a quiet promise. If they returned, they would not return halfway. They would not ask you to carry the emotional burden alone. They would speak honestly about what happened. They would explain what they knew and what they still needed to discover. Most importantly, they would stop pretending that fear was the same thing as wisdom. That night, they went outside again. The air was cooler than before. The streets were almost empty. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. They looked upward and felt something difficult to describe. It was not certainty about the future. It was peace about taking the next honest step. They understood that divine timing does not always remove every obstacle first. Sometimes it gives a person the courage to face the obstacle correctly. Their journey was entering that stage. They were no longer waiting for circumstances to become perfect. They were becoming strong enough to meet imperfect circumstances with truth. Somewhere inside that realization, your connection changed again. It was no longer only a memory. It became a responsibility. They had to decide what kind of person they would be when they finally stood before you. Would they arrive carrying excuses? Or would they arrive carrying honesty? Would they ask you to understand their fear? Or would they understand the pain their fear caused you? The answer slowly became clear. They wanted to become someone worthy of the conversation they had been avoiding. That meant changing more than their relationship status. It meant changing themselves. Their pride had to soften. Their communication had to mature. Their boundaries had to strengthen. Their relationship with family expectations had to become healthier. They had to stop measuring their worth through everyone's approval. This was the deeper spiritual work hidden beneath the DNA discovery. The test exposed more than family information. It exposed the emotional architecture surrounding your soulmate. And once they saw it, they could no longer pretend the structure was healthy. They had to rebuild. Slowly. Intentionally. Honestly. The first brick they removed was fear. The second was shame. The third was the belief that choosing love automatically meant betraying family. What remained underneath those layers was something much simpler. A desire to live truthfully. And that desire kept pointing toward one person. You. They still did not know exactly how the next conversation would unfold. They did not know how their relatives would respond. They did not know whether you would trust them immediately. But for the first time, they were willing to accept uncertainty. They would rather face an uncertain future honestly than live inside a predictable life built on fear. That was the moment the emotional distance began shrinking. Not through physical movement. Through inner alignment. The person who once ran from difficult feelings had finally stopped running. And when someone stops running from their truth, the path toward the person they love begins to look different. Something changed in the way your soulmate began preparing for the future. They no longer imagined returning to you as a desperate escape from their circumstances. They wanted to return with clarity. That distinction changed everything. Their first step was learning to sit with uncomfortable truth without immediately retreating. They stopped avoiding family conversations. They stopped pretending that old expectations still controlled their choices. They began asking questions with a calmness that surprised even them. Some answers were painful. Others revealed gaps in the family story. But every answer gave them more confidence. They were finally becoming an active participant in their own life. For years, circumstances had decided too much for them. Now they wanted their own voice back. That process affected their daily habits. They became quieter in certain situations. They listened more carefully. They noticed when fear entered their thoughts. Instead of automatically obeying it, they questioned where it came from. Sometimes the answer was family pressure. Sometimes it was pride. Sometimes it was the fear of being rejected by you. That last fear was especially difficult. Your soulmate wondered whether you would believe them if they finally explained everything. They imagined your expression. They imagined the silence after their confession. They imagined you asking why they had waited so long. They had no perfect answer. They could only offer the truth. And they knew the truth would have to include their mistakes. That realization made them more mature. They stopped imagining a reunion where everything instantly became beautiful. They understood that genuine healing requires patience. If they returned to your world, they wanted to earn trust instead of demanding it. This was the first visible sign that their inner transformation was becoming real. Their courage was no longer an emotion. It was becoming behavior. They began preparing for difficult conversations. They wrote down what they needed to explain. Then they crossed out the sentences that sounded defensive. They rewrote the parts that blamed other people. They removed excuses. What remained was simple. They had been afraid. They had allowed family expectations to influence their choices. They had cared about you more than they admitted. They had not known how to handle the conflict. And now they wanted to face it honestly. Reading those words made their chest tighten. They knew sending them would change everything. So they waited. Not from fear this time. From respect. They wanted to speak when they could give you their full attention. Meanwhile, the family continued processing the DNA discovery. Some relatives remained shocked. Others became defensive. A few began searching through their own memories. The atmosphere was no longer comfortable. But your soulmate no longer interpreted discomfort as a reason to surrender. They understood that uncomfortable truth can still be necessary truth. 1. Evening, another family discussion began unexpectedly. Someone suggested returning to the old explanation. Your soulmate listened quietly. Then they asked a question nobody expected. Where is the evidence for that? The room became still. Nobody answered immediately. That silence told them more than words could. The old belief had survived largely because nobody challenged it. Now it was being challenged. Your soulmate felt their fear rise, but they remained seated. Their voice stayed calm. They asked for documents. They asked for dates. They asked who had originally made the decision. One relative became emotional. Another became frustrated. But the conversation continued. For the first time, your soulmate did not disappear when the room became tense. They stayed. That was a major victory. Not because they had won an argument. Because they had finally learned how to stand inside conflict without abandoning themselves. After the conversation ended, they walked outside. Their hands were cold. Their heart was beating quickly. Yet they felt lighter. They had survived the moment they once feared. They realized courage was not the absence of trembling. Courage was continuing while trembling. That insight brought them closer to the decision they had been postponing. They began thinking about you more concretely. Not only about memories. About real life. About what a future together would require. They imagined ordinary mornings. Shared meals. Difficult conversations. Responsibilities. Laughter after stressful days. Quiet moments when neither person needed to explain anything. The vision was not glamorous. That made it feel real. They did not want a fantasy anymore. They wanted something honest enough to survive reality. They began examining their own readiness. Could they communicate better? Could they set boundaries with family? Could they protect the relationship without creating unnecessary conflict? Could they accept that your healing might take time? Could they apologize without expecting immediate forgiveness? Each question demanded humility. Their answers were not perfect. But they were honest. They realized they still had work to do. So they began doing it. They changed how they spoke about the past. They stopped romanticizing their silence. They stopped describing their withdrawal as something noble. They admitted that fear had caused pain. That admission became a turning point. Their heart was no longer asking how to get you back. It was asking how to become trustworthy enough to approach you again. That is a much deeper transformation. Meanwhile, their physical world began changing too. They started organizing practical matters they had ignored. Personal responsibilities were brought under control. Important documents were reviewed. Financial concerns were examined. Old commitments were reconsidered. They wanted fewer unfinished matters hanging over their future. It was not about creating a perfect life. It was about creating enough stability to make an honest choice. They understood that love requires more than emotion. It requires responsibility. It requires communication. It requires courage when circumstances become complicated. The DNA discovery had forced them to recognize that marriage could never be treated as a simple romantic decision. Too many family beliefs had surrounded it. Too many assumptions had shaped it. They needed to enter any future relationship with open eyes. That included you. They wanted to tell you everything without hiding the uncomfortable parts. They wanted you to understand what happened. But they also wanted you to have the freedom to decide what happened next. This was where their love became less possessive and more mature. They began understanding that genuine connection cannot be forced. It must be chosen by both people. That realization brought peace. They no longer needed to control the outcome. They only needed to control their honesty. One night, they finally opened your old conversation again. Their thumb rested above the message field. The screen illuminated their face in the dark room. They typed several words. Deleted them. Tried again. Deleted those too. Then they wrote something simple. There are things I should have told you. They stared at the sentence for a long time. Their heart raced. They knew those 6 words could open years of silence. They did not send the message immediately. Instead, they placed the phone down. They walked to the window. The city lights looked distant and quiet. They took a deep breath. Then another. They asked themselves whether they were ready to accept every possible response. Maybe you would be angry. Maybe you would be cautious. Maybe you would not respond. Maybe you would need time. They understood that possibility. And for once, they were willing to respect it. They returned to the phone. Their hand no longer trembled as strongly. They read the sentence again. Then they added another line. I finally understand why I kept pulling away. That sentence carried the weight of years. They paused again. Their eyes became wet. They realized they were not only preparing to speak with you. They were preparing to meet the person they had become. The old version of them would have deleted everything. The new version wanted truth. That difference was enormous. They pressed save instead of send. Not because they had lost courage. Because they wanted to speak properly. The next day, they began preparing for that conversation in another way. They imagined sitting across from you. They imagined listening instead of defending themselves. They imagined allowing silence without rushing to fill it. They imagined hearing your hurt without becoming defensive. They imagined saying sorry without adding explanations afterward. These mental rehearsals were not romantic fantasies. They were emotional preparation. Your soulmate understood that if they came back, they could not repeat the same pattern. The connection needed a different version of them. A steadier version. A more honest version. A version willing to choose truth even when truth was uncomfortable. Their family might not immediately approve. The past might remain complicated. Questions might still exist. But they were no longer waiting for every obstacle to disappear. They were learning how to walk forward while obstacles remained. This was the quiet courage growing inside them. It was not loud. Nobody applauded it. There was no dramatic announcement. But day by day, they became less afraid of their own heart. They began realizing that the biggest distance between you had never been measured in miles. It had been measured in hesitation. Every honest decision reduced that distance. Every boundary reduced it. Every difficult conversation reduced it. Every moment of self-respect reduced it. And eventually, your soulmate reached a point where staying silent felt harder than speaking. That was when the future stopped looking like an impossible dream. It started looking like a decision. They still needed to understand the remaining family details. They still needed to approach you carefully. But internally, the direction had become unmistakable. They were moving toward courage. They were moving toward truth. And somewhere beyond the fear, they were moving toward the conversation that could finally explain why they had never been able to give you the future they secretly wanted. And now the deepest truth begins to settle into place. The DNA discovery did not erase the years of confusion. It finally gave those years a name. Your soulmate realized that the barrier between you was built from fear, family assumptions, and an incomplete understanding of the past. What they once called impossible had never been fully understood. That realization changed the way they looked at you. They no longer saw your connection as something that simply failed. They saw it as something interrupted by circumstances neither of you completely controlled. The family was stunned because the truth forced them to question decisions that had shaped more than one generation. But your soulmate faced an even more personal awakening. They had to admit that their silence had caused its own kind of distance. They could not change yesterday. They could change what they did next. So they began choosing honesty over avoidance. They began choosing courage over inherited fear. They began choosing a future based on truth rather than assumptions. And that choice brought a quiet peace they had not felt for years. Somewhere in their heart, they knew the conversation with you could no longer remain postponed forever. They understood that returning to you would require humility. They would need to explain the family discovery. They would need to acknowledge the moments when they hurt you. They would need to listen without defending themselves. Most importantly, they would need to respect whatever choice you made after hearing the truth. That is what makes this transformation meaningful. It is not about forcing destiny. It is about becoming honest enough to meet destiny with open eyes. The physical distance between your worlds may still exist for a while. But the emotional distance has already begun shrinking. A person who once hid behind silence is now preparing to speak. A person who once accepted family expectations without question is now asking for truth. A person who once believed losing you was unavoidable is finally wondering whether the story was ever finished. Your connection is entering a different chapter. Not because everything suddenly became perfect. Because both truth and courage have finally entered the room. If this message found you at the right moment, allow it to remind you of something important. You do not have to chase what is meant to meet you honestly. You do not have to prove your worth through exhaustion. You do not have to carry another person's confusion as your burden. Keep growing. Keep healing. Keep your heart open without abandoning your boundaries. Let truth reveal what belongs in your life. And if this message touched something deep inside you, write, "I choose truth," in the comments. Let those words become your declaration of peace, strength, and self-respect. Subscribe if you want more spiritual soulmate messages that help you reflect, heal, and recognize meaningful signs without fear. Share this message with someone who may need encouragement today. And remember this final truth. Sometimes the love story does not change when someone finally finds you. It changes when they finally become brave enough to stop running from what their heart already knows.